The autumn wind is a pirate, blustering in from sea. With a rollicking song he sweeps along, swaggering boisterously. His face is weather-beaten. He wears a hooded sash, with a silver hat about his head, and a bristling black mustache. He growls as he storms the country, a villain big and bold. And the trees all shake and quiver and quake as he robs them of their gold. The autumn wind is a raider, pillaging just for fun.
I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks.
Great cash, homie.
I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks.
Great cash, homie. Everybody want clout.
Welcome to the Week 7 edition of the Rearview Mirror podcast, where we take a look back at everything in our rearview mirror from Week 6, try to analyze it and break it down, figure out a little bit more about these teams and who they are. How do they win these games? Why do they lose these games? What we can learn from these teams, and try to add it to our handicapping repertoire to get a better understanding and a feel for these teams as we move forward, so that we can try to be more efficient and sophisticated when projecting outcomes for the Week 7 games. We've got a lot of information to get to on this podcast. We're going to cover some news stories, look at some of the key advanced metrics and analytics that I look at. I'm going to show you a very brand new analytic I've never showed you on this podcast before, though I talk about it often. And I'm also going to get into some of these games at a very detailed analytical level to understand some of the stats and metrics behind the outcomes of these games. Then we're going to get into injuries and some looks at the Week 7 games. So with that said, let's jump right into the headlines. Story number 1, unexpected outcomes. We're not talking here about why a team covered, why a team did not cover. We're not talking about the actual result from a sports betting angle. What we're talking about here is shows or no-shows. We're talking about teams that just failed to show up and how this could happen. We're talking about teams that we didn't expect this effort out of them, particularly from a production standpoint, and how this could have occurred. So, for instance, we'll detail a lot of these in the actual game-by-game breakdowns, but the top 3 teams, I'd say, that disappointed from a production standpoint. Not that they didn't win their game, not that they didn't cover their game, but the fact that they didn't produce anything, and largely nobody could have forecasted it. Number 1, the New York Giants scoring 0 points against the Eagles. You have 0 points through the first half. How do you not figure out a way at halftime to put up any type of production on the scoreboard? The Eagles' defense is mediocre at best. There's certainly elements of their defense that indicates it's not good whatsoever. And so for this Giants team that's been rolling for a couple weeks to score nothing and not figure out a single way to adjust to give their quarterback more protection, that was a shock. Team number 2, the Atlanta Falcons. This is a team off of key performances on the road, putting up a lot of points in Minnesota. Next week, putting up a lot of points in New York versus the Giants. They come home to a Chicago Bears defense who, let's face it, are not the 1985 Bears. This is a defense that can be exploited, was not very good last year, has had a lot of injuries this year, and they put up 1 touchdown the entire game at home to the Atlanta Falcons, whose offense had been rolling. They scored 2 other field goals, so they put up 13 points the entire game in a home game against this Chicago Bears defense. Very surprising performance there for that offense to not do more. And team number 3 were the Pittsburgh Steelers. This team, again, you're looking at a Cleveland Browns opponent who they played. The Browns had just allowed, I think, 29 points, something like that, to the Tennessee Titans, whose offense is not very good. We saw that against the Jacksonville Jaguars this past weekend, where they struggled against the Jaguars as well. The Tennessee Titans, led by their starting quarterback who got injured, in comes Charlie Whitehurst, throws a couple of touchdown passes, was able to do a lot of damage. Cleveland comes home and shuts out the Pittsburgh Steelers. First 3 quarters, the Steelers only score 1 field goal. They end up scoring a touchdown later in the game. In the fourth quarter, they put up a total of 10 points on the board. Don't know that it was a shock that the Cleveland Browns won that game. Obviously, they were favored to win that game, but it's the manner in which that Pittsburgh Steelers offense did absolutely nothing, which was surprising. Looking at teams that overperformed expectations, obviously, we're going to talk about the Dallas Cowboys in great detail later in the podcast, so I'm not going to get too deep into this right now, but that was a team. The biggest surprise for me there was the time of possession. They controlled the ball essentially for 38 minutes. The Seattle Seahawks only had it for 22 minutes. That was the largest time of possession disparity of any game this weekend. So that was the biggest thing to me. It was how that defense performed, how the offense performed in controlling the game. It wasn't necessarily that they covered the spread or that they pulled out the upset, because I put out a blueprint out there of what you can do against the Seattle Seahawks. And if you're very balanced, it can be efficient, and don't just run your head into a wall trying to run the ball. If you actually can establish a little bit of a run and get some great things going in the passing game, it's really going to open things up against that defense. That's exactly what Dallas was able to do. I wasn't sure if they were going to be able to do it to start the game. Certainly, once I saw the game being played out, took the Dallas Cowboys at halftime, and obviously they were able to pull out the outright upset, but very shocked to see the time of possession and the way that they did it. Second team was the Carolina Panthers. How in the world this offense is putting up the production that it's doing without any type of run game from running backs? All their mainstay running backs from last season are injured. Talked about D'Angelo Williams, Jonathan Stewart, Mike Tolbert. None of these guys are there. Their offensive line is not that great, and yet they put up over 30 points and beat the Bears last weekend. They put up 37 points and tie with the Bengals on the road this weekend. Very shocking performances here by the Cincinnati Bengals defense in back-to-back weeks, and by the Carolina Panthers offense. You've got to take your hats off to them. So I was very impressed and surprised by how many points this offense was able to score on the road in Cincinnati. And then a similar theme to our final team that surprised was the Oakland Raiders. The team put up 28 points against the San Diego Chargers. I think we all might have thought that the Chargers, this game might have been a little bit lower scoring, perhaps, that the Oakland Raiders still could have gotten the cover. But to think that the San Diego Chargers would have to score 31 points just to beat the Oakland Raiders. We know the San Diego defense is not great, but they've been playing well the past several weeks, and very impressive to see this young rookie Carr come out there and throw the ball around the field and put up 28 points against San Diego. Even though it was a loss, it was the manner in which they were scoring their points that was impressive. That brings us right into the blowouts. Are these games being decided by more points than we've seen in the past? How are we seeing more of these games not very close, not very competitive, not very fun or exciting to watch? Are your eyes deceiving you, or is this the way it seems to be this year? The answer is yes to all of the above, and your eyes are not deceiving you. This is what's happening this year. We are seeing record numbers of blowouts and games that just aren't even competitive. We are seeing so far out of 90 games where a team has won this year, over half of those were won by 11-plus points, meaning that you need two-possession game to even tie this game if you're getting a field goal, a touchdown, and it's two-point conversion. These games are not even close, and in many cases, this is not a trend. We are seeing the next closest year that we've seen many blowouts compared to this year was 2003, so over a decade ago. And, of course, 2012 and 2013, the last couple of years, are right around smack dab in the middle of this list, seeing 37 blowouts. And then you look at 2010, which is way down at the bottom of this list, only 28. So this definitely is something that is more surprising than anything this season, to see this many blowouts and teams that are leading by big margins even at halftime transition to primetime games. And we're seeing the same thing, only worse. And that's why some of these networks probably aren't that happy about the viewership, because we are seeing ridiculous numbers of primetime games that aren't even close. Now, you have to almost segregate this out and caveat it by saying that the last couple of years we've seen more primetime Thursday night games early in the season. So even accounting for that, you look at 2013 compared to 2014, the top two games on this list, where you play the same number of primetime games, we've seen double the games won by 20-plus points in primetime this year compared to last year with the same number of primetime games. And we're seeing over double of these games, 8 compared to 3, where the game was up and pretty much over at halftime, where a team is up by 17-plus points at the half. If you look back over history, though, you can even look back at the last few years prior to this. If you want to scroll down the list, I've color-coordinated the years in green or red to understand what are the more recent years. You can look down at 2011, 2012, 2010. These are seasons where we've seen maybe a couple of games that were blowout games. You look at 2011 and 12, one game in 2011, two games in 2012. Here we're at 10 games in 2014. The interesting thing here, too, is the line. If you look over to the far right-hand column, the average line on these games. Here this season, the average line where the team is winning by so many points, they're only favored by an average of 2 points per game. Compare that to, let's say, 1992 or 2001, which are further down on this list. Those teams were favored by 10.5 points. So the fact that they were up by 17 at the half is not as surprising, because they were supposed to win by 10.5, so they're not even maybe in some cases covering by more than a touchdown, and the game isn't close because the game wasn't projected to be close. In this situation, these teams are covering the spread by over 2 touchdowns, 15 points at halftime on average, and they're up. They win the game by 20-plus points. So ridiculous swings compared to what the line maker anticipated. So then you ask yourself, why? As you can see off to the far right, we're seeing a number of these teams are playing at home. They might be a small dog. They might be a small favorite. They are home teams in general performing these blowouts. So then the question is, well, what about these road teams? Are they just not prepared? Are they being caught off guard? What is happening? And I think what we're noticing is that it's not 100% a coaching issue, although I think that does play a factor. If you look at some of these teams that are getting blown out, you are having the home team coming with a very solid, well-researched, well-designed game plan and strategy, and the road team just simply getting overwhelmed. And it seems like more and more teams are just incapable of making adjustments at halftime to figure out what they need to do to get back into the game. And even good coaches, if you look at Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, they show up on this list as a team that was blown out by the Kansas City Chiefs on the road in Week 4. Now they came back and they blew out the Bengals the very next week in prime time. But there are just so many of these teams that get down early and cannot figure a way out of that. And that to me is more coaching than anything else. Not being able to figure out what to do in the midst of a game where your plan A is not working, you've got to figure out how to get back on track. And more, I think this year we're seeing teams not figure that out. It's not that the favorite or the team that wins this game in the winner column is so significantly and substantially better than their opponent, and everybody completely underestimated and missed the boat. It's just a snowball type effect where that team has just got everything rolling, it seems, and the opponent is just working in the opposite direction with their feet in quicksand, not able to figure out what to do, and just getting steamrolled, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So certainly interesting results there. We'll see how that continues, or maybe it'll stop, and these coaches will figure out better ways to adjust. But as of now, that's what we're seeing. Story number 2, utilizing NFLproject.com and our handicapping. I'll give you an update on this. As I mentioned in the last podcast, I'll kind of cover it right now for those of you who might be listening to this for the first time. NFLproject.com is a website utilizing machine learning algorithms based on the mortgage industry, run on these ridiculous servers for hours and hours to compute and calculate projections for the 2014 season, run every single week to look at where teams sit in terms of playoff standing seedings for the playoffs, division winners, those types of things, Super Bowl odds. But there are a number of other cool features that we're able to utilize this website for, and one of them is to look at results from the prior week in terms of how bad a team was hurt by loss or how much a win helped the team. And what I've noticed here is that you can take some of this information and fade or play on teams who were either helped or hurt, and it's really been beneficial. So let's look at an example from this past weekend. This graphic up here is week 6, and this is based on the results from week 5. Heading into week 6, you can see teams that were really hurt or really helped by those results. Let's start and just mention high level. One of the teams off to the right, the Detroit Lions. This was a team who was a home favorite over the Buffalo Bills by 7 points. They were supposed to win that game. They ended up dropping that game. They were upset. They lost it outright in a game that they were supposed to win. They're trying to compete in the NFC North with a bunch of other teams, including Green Bay Packers, who won, the Chicago Bears, who won, and a number of other teams. So it was a very difficult spot that they put themselves in. They actually dropped 35% on their playoff odds having lost that game. So that was a huge loss, even though it was only by a few points. It really affected their team's outcome. What we do in these situations is you're looking to play on that team the very next week. So in that spot, this team went up to Minnesota, and they ended up getting the outright victory. They did not do it with offense. They did it with their defense. Their offense was very, very mediocre in that game. Without Calvin Johnson, without Reggie Bush, that offense was not very productive. But their defense completely shut down Teddy Bridgewater, and that's how they won that game. If you look at the team next to them, the Baltimore Ravens, similarly, they lost to the Indianapolis Colts on the road. They were supposed to lose to the Colts. That said, it still dropped them big time due to the rest of the results in the AFC that past weekend and how competitive that conference is right now. The Baltimore Ravens were in a spot where they're looking to face off with the Cincinnati Bengals for the leaders of that division, but at the time, the Bengals were 3-1, Steelers were 3-2, and you had the Ravens who had just lost to the Indianapolis Colts. The Indianapolis Colts and the Houston Texans were tied for first place in that division. They obviously played Thursday night, but this was run before those games, and so heading into that game, those two teams are battling for who's going to win the AFC South and who's going to get the wild card seed in the AFC South. And of course, the teams out west, you've got a one-loss San Diego Chargers and a one-loss Denver Broncos, so it looks like one of those teams for certain is taking that first wild card seed. So all these other teams in the AFC are battling for a wild card seed, and the Baltimore Ravens lost to one of those teams that they're competing with, the Indianapolis Colts. So it really hurt their playoff chances, even though most people probably would look at that game and be like, oh, no big deal, they lost to the Colts, they were underdogs anyways. It really hurt them in the playoff seeding, and they know that. They know what they need to do the next week, so they go into Tampa Bay and are able to get it done in a big way, winning quite easily. If you look over at the left, not the same level of detail, but there were a couple teams there that had huge victories, the Green Bay Packers, the New England Patriots. So the goal there would be to play against them this weekend. So if you took the Miami Dolphins at +3.5, or you took the Buffalo Bills at +3, you were playing against those teams this past week. And what we ended up seeing is the Green Bay Packers, sure enough, did not cover that 3.5-point line. They needed a very late touchdown just to get the win in Miami by 3 points. So overall, if you faded the two teams on the left and played on the two teams on the right, you went 3-1 against the spread this week. And so far, the results for the season have been very strong. And I'll go ahead and go through those updated results with you right now. But if you simply play on the teams who are off to the far right and take them after they've had a crushing loss to their playoff chances, you are 8-2 against the spread this year, including 6-0 if that team is favored, and a 5-0 at home. If you fade the teams on the left, the top teams each week who get hurt the most or are helped the most from the prior week's result, if you fade them, you're 7-4 against the spread. And if those teams are favorites and you fade them as a favorite, you're 6-3 against the spread. So combining those two together, you're getting a pretty strong performance right now of 15-6 against the spread overall, just by playing on the teams that were hurt the most for their playoff seeds and fading the teams that were helped the most from the prior week. So pretty good resource here. You want to go to it each week to find out what the latest numbers are to get a good idea. We'll see if this carries forward. This is the first year I've even looked at this data. It was just invented, so I have no idea what it's going to do, but I'm obviously tracking it to see. Another cool thing that the site has started doing this very past week, is looking at some of the true odds heading into a game based upon what could happen in that game and how that could affect a team's playoff seeding. So, for instance, this website previously was showing all types of information for after each week's games heading into the next week's games. How is this team seeded? What are they likely going to do from here on out, assuming an average return of that upcoming game? So heading into week 6, it gave the Indianapolis Colts a X percentage chance of beating the Houston Texans, and it did the same thing throughout the course of the rest of the teams, and then obviously it runs its algorithm and figures out how many wins on average this team's going to have and says, okay, well, right now the Indianapolis Colts are X% chance to make the playoffs. But now what we're able to see is these specific variances based upon what might happen in those very next games that they're going to play to get a good idea of what games really, really matter and what games might be inconsequential. And to each team, it's different. For instance, if you look at the far left of this graphic, the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts, that game was very important to both teams, obviously a divisional game. Both teams were 3-2. One team was going to go to 4-2. One team was going to go to 3-3. Very important game. It ends up that the Houston Texans lose that game. So they drop. They could have been probably at over a 50% chance likely to make the playoffs with a win. They drop all the way to 27%. And the Indianapolis Colts improve. They could have been only around 50% to make the playoffs. Now they're up sitting around 81%, primarily because very likely now that they're going to win that AFC South division. The next game that they face, the Houston Texans, is going to be in Indianapolis. So this really gave them a good stranglehold over that division. And you can look through these teams as you move across and see how vitally important it was for the Bills to try to get a win over the Patriots. I know their head coach is saying they think they can make the playoffs this year. Well, good luck. After blowing that game against the Patriots last week, now you're probably down around 20% chance to make the playoffs. You could have been up close to 50%, upper 40% range had you won that game, but that game really cost you losing at home to the Patriots. A big win for the 49ers on the road on Monday night is really going to help that team a lot, and obviously the Cardinals got the win over the Redskins, so that helps them. Scroll over to the right, you can see that for teams that are either well out of the playoffs or probably still strong favorites to make the playoffs regardless of a single game, the game's percentages didn't really affect those teams or were not projected to. So, for instance, if the Denver Broncos happened to lose last weekend to the Jets, they would have still been very high percentage, 90% to make the playoffs. They did not lose, so they're 97% approximately. And the Seattle Seahawks, they only dropped probably to the upper 80% range by losing that game. We'll have to see, based upon all the results from all the teams, what this week's true projections show, so we can grade these and see where these look-ahead values accurate, somewhat, very close, very on the spot. What was the range there? But these are the projections based on wins or losses. Now we'll be able to look back at this week 6 data, looking ahead to week 7 to get a better feel for exactly where the teams stand based on all the results that happened, all the upsets and all the victories and defeats this past week. So very cool site. I encourage you to check it out. Story number 3, looking at sports betting angles with particular interest in the right side. If you are not interested in sports betting, I encourage you to just fast forward to when we get to the end of this slide because you're not really going to want to care about this. But let's for a moment discuss what is, quote-unquote, the right side. How do you measure if you're on the right side? This has been a topic that sort of started trending a little bit on Twitter and whatnot after we had this past weekend NFL games where many games were decided by last-second scores, pick sixes, or things of that nature. And so the question became, well, was I on the right side or not? Did I get a lucky win? Did I not? And based on what I do and what I've had success with historically, one thing I like to look at is measuring how do you know if you're on the right side or not. And the more involvement and experience you have, you kind of have a good understanding to do a lot of these things, second nature. But it's good to go through and just organize this checklist for you. Primarily, in a nutshell, would you make that bet again? If you're watching the game, you're seeing the way that the game plays out, would you make that bet again, even if you lost the game? Because I think too many people are results-oriented in the industry, and that's exactly what the sports books want you to be. If you think about it, the books want you to only care about what you just did. They want you to chase a loss because you feel like you should have won and you lost, so they want you to chase that. They want you to bet again when you had a victory. If you just laid the favorite and they covered with these, they want you to take another big favorite and just keep betting again on these big favorites and hoping to cover with these. They want you to care only about what you just did. Intelligent sports bettors know that that's pure folly, and that's why the guys who talk about you're only as good as your last bet are, I couldn't disagree more with that. Even when you're on like a 6-0 run or something like that, the goal is long-term profit in this industry. If you're going to tell me that a guy who hits 30% of his bets over the course of 2 years and now won his last game is suddenly better than a guy who's hitting 57% of his bets over a 5-year span and happens to lose his last game, there's nobody in the world who would think that person who keeps hemorrhaging money is the more intelligent sports bettor. But that's what some of these guys try to lead you to believe, who don't want you to look at their long-term records and just focus on little short streaks that they're on. But paying more attention to this chart here in front of you, how do you measure the games? Let's start with number 1. Did you get line value based on the closing number? Sometimes you are going to disagree with the marketplace, and sometimes the marketplace is wrong. And sometimes there's just teams that some of these betting groups really dislike or really like, and you have a different opinion. And you might actually be right. A few weeks in a row, they're going to bet games the wrong way, opposite of you, and you're going to be right. But at the end of the day, it's only going to take a few weeks for them to come around. And so it's not like you're going to be able to go through a whole season where you're going to get opposite line movement on a team and consistently be correct about it. For the vast majority of the times, you are going to want to be on the side where the money is, because these guys are doing this professionally for a living. They're the ones who are going to be winning more than they're losing. And so you're going to want to try to get on the side that has the line value. So if you're laying 7 points on a favorite, you're going to want that game and hope that game is going to close at 8, 8.5, 10. You do not want to be taking and laying 7 points on a game where all the sharp money comes in on the underdog and the line closes at 3. Now, we did see a number of these cases this past weekend where the underdog took a ridiculous amount of money. They might have been +3, +3.5, closed at a pick 'em, maybe even a small favorite, and ended up losing the game. But in the long run, those are the sides that are going to win. A lot of different things happen in games, and sometimes those games, just because you got a great line, that does not ensure that you're going to win that game. It just is a good, helpful guide to get an idea of, did the market concur with your analysis and opinion on that game? Number 2, did your wager beat the first half line, even if you did not bet the first half? it's vitally important. This is a good marker halfway through the game to get a good gauge on, is the bet going your way or not. There's a sports betting app that I helped invent called Better Sidekick, and it's available on iTunes. And what Better Sidekick does, particularly for totals, is it will show you a pace of play statistic based upon the line you got on the game and what you bet, how the pace is going according to your bet. Is your bet winning or losing at all points throughout the game? It informs you of that. This halfway middle of the road marker is kind of that same thing, just sliced in half at one quick split second. Did you beat the second half number? So if you're betting under a college game, the total is 71, and the halftime number is 35.5. And if there's only 13 points scored in that first half, then you bet the full game. Well, you're doing a very good job. You had a great prediction that this game should be an under game, and you're dead on through the first half. Now, I will say, and throw a caveat in here, that we're not accounting for statistics or things of that nature. So let's say, for instance, if a team enters to the red zone 6 times during the first half and keeps turning the ball over to their opponent, well, your projection is not as good as it was a second ago before I told you that, because there easily could have been a lot of points on the scoreboard, but there was all sorts of red zone turnovers that prevents them from happening. And you probably would be in your best interest to bet over on the second half number to give yourself a really solid middle in that situation. But be that as it may, I'm assuming you're taking into account statistics and turnovers and things of that nature when you're looking at, did I get on the right side of games? These are more higher level things that maybe you aren't thinking about heading into your processing of were you on the right side or not. Then you look at, what was the second half line? Obviously, if the second half, let's say you're on a game that's very close to the halftime number, which means you're very close to your full game number. But if that second half number comes out at something which is well over your second half number, well, then you're getting some good line value on whatever you were on for the full game. Let me give you an example. From this past Monday night's game, at halftime, the second half number was 23. And some spots open at 21.5, bet up to 23. Some spots 23, bet up to 23.5. There were 24 points scored in the first half. So now you're looking at a game where the in-game number that odds makers are taking action on is effectively 47. So if you bet over at 43.5, you've got some line value there, projecting now that this thing is going to land 47. Now, it's not massive, certainly not as massive as what you could get on some college totals where the line could be way off, and you're getting a lot better value there on the second half in terms of what it could be or won't be. And that doesn't really indicate anything as to whether or not you'll win your final bet ultimately, because a lot of things happen in football and games that could be going one way in the first half, go a different way in the second half. But it's a good idea to look at what that second half number is to get an understanding of, were you in a position of value at that point in time or not. Number 3, was there any sort of ridiculous scoring barrage that occurred? We change a slow game to quick game to slow game, et cetera, or vice versa. So, for instance, if you're looking at a game and you bet the under at 45, and the first half sees 2 field goals back and forth, the second half, third quarter, sees a touchdown from one team and a field goal from their opponent, and so you're actually sitting on a game which only has 19 points through 3 quarters. That's a game where you should feel pretty good about. You're seeing well less than what they are projected on the scoreboard, and all of a sudden in the fourth quarter, they throw up ridiculous scoring barrage. Teams go back and forth and score 5 touchdowns in that quarter alone, and the game sails over the total. That is a game where you're looking at, what in the hell just happened here to me? My bet was on track for the first 3 quarters. All of a sudden, there's a scoring back and forth where it's touchdown after touchdown. A great, if you can remember back to last year in the snow, Baltimore Ravens hosted the Minnesota Vikings, and that game saw all these touchdowns for the final couple minutes of the game on these big special teams plays or pass plays or runs in the snow, and it was ridiculous the way that they started scoring at the end. That does not mean that the over was the right side in the game just because they start scoring at the end there like that. Is definitely an under game that happened to go over thanks to all these scores and inabilities to tackle people at the very end of the game. So you have to factor that into it. And then number 4, what was the in-game number over the course of the game? This is something that you're only going to be able to see generally for primetime games, big games in the NFL, let's say, where you can look at the pinnacle line throughout the game and see what it's being traded at. And that's a very good indicator as to whether or not you put in a good bet or not in terms of whether you're on the right side. For instance, if you bet an over at 43, 44, and the in-game number frequently is trading at 47, 48, 51 throughout the course of the game, gets no less than what you bet on the game, then that's a good indicator that you're on the right side. And if at the very end of that game it drops down to below 41 or below what you bet over 40, 44, whatever it was, and then finally drops below that at the very end of the game, well, that shows you that there's something happened there at the end of that game that turned probably the right side, which was the over because it was trading over your number for most of the game, into an under, which indicates to me that generally speaking, you were on the right side projecting the over, but some things happened which ultimately went cause that game potentially to go under. So long story short here, these are steps I like to take when I'm measuring the right side of games, and I'll let you go ahead and use this information as you like. I'm sure other people have other ways that they like to look at it. This is the way I've looked at it for years. I've advised my clients to look at games because betting is a process, especially on sports. There's a ton of short-term variance. Even when you're great at this, you're not going to win over probably 60-some% for more than the course of a year or several months. In the long run, you're looking to hit 55, 56, 57% maybe if you're great. And so there's a lot of variance. You're losing a large percentage of your games even on a good year. And so the goal here is to always learn from your bets and make smart bets moving forward and understand, are you losing these bets because your methods might be slipping up, or are you just having a string of really bad luck? Because that is very easy to have at times when you're betting on sports. Everyone goes into those slumps or those streaks where just no breaks seem to be going their way. And, you know, I'll jump into this real quick and then we'll move along because I'm tired of talking about this, to be honest with you. But there are those sports bettors out there who think that the bad luck will be offset by good luck and eventually everything should even out for you and you'll just be okay at the end of the day. Just keep betting long enough and everything will even out for you. But I can tell you, when you are generally a more intelligent sports bettor and you're a more winning bettor, that you are, when you look at the variety of games, you look at the games that you lose badly, you look at the games where you win tremendously, you're totally on the right side. You're obviously going to have more of the games where you win tremendously and you're totally on the right side in terms of percentage of your bets than you will the games that you are way off. So let's say the average bettor, he'll win 20% of his games in blowout fashion and lose 20% of his games in blowout fashion. But the really smart guy, he might win 30% of his games in blowout fashion, only lose 10% of his games in bad fashion in terms of being completely wrong on the game. So then you look at the games that are close. And what ends up happening is, for the guy who is a bad bettor, he'll even his luck out in the long run. But the guys who are more sharp, who are more on the right side of games, who understand things, they naturally, by nature, are going to have a higher percentage of their losses that are the ridiculous variety where it's the right side and stuff just happens to make them lose at the end. That is going to be a larger percent of their losses. Their wins are going to be bigger wins, and they're going to have a smaller percentage of the games where they were on the wrong side, but they got breaks to go in their favor, which I can tell you from experience definitely seems to happen for me. There are very few games where I'm just rejoicing that we got the pick six to go our way, because more often than not, those plays work against us to cause good bets to lose, and that just happens to be a higher percentage of the losses are situations like that. For somebody who is more intelligent at their betting and usually has a better track record, you're going to have more of your losses of this grueling, ridiculous, how could this have happened variety where I was winning for most of the game on the right side and I end up losing. The average guy is going to have his fair share of some of those and some great wins because he's not really in tune with what he's doing and he's not really a long-term winning bettor. So he's going to have a lot more of these great wins where he gets saved by things like that because he was on the wrong side and stuff just happened great for him at the end. So he'll see that more often than a really good bettor will see it. And the really good bettor will see more often these ridiculous losses than the average bettor will. That's just the way it is. All right, as usual, we're going to start with early down success rate, but I do have a surprise for you in a couple slides. But first, let's just focus on early down success rate. These offenses are pretty much the same. The only guy who's moved up here into the top five recently is the Washington Redskins, and it might surprise you, but they actually were very efficient in their game against the Arizona Cardinals last weekend, and they do have a top five efficiency offense in terms of early down success rate. We know that they struggle at times with turnovers, specifically from the quarterback position, throwing interceptions, but in general, their early down success rate numbers offensively have been pretty strong. This considers strength of schedule as well, so they did play some crappy teams in there, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Houston Texans early in the year, but overall, the early down success rate numbers are strong. I do think that the offense needs to work with their play calling, with some of their balance. I think they run too often when they aren't productive. I think in those cases they definitely need to turn to the pass to try to open up the run a little bit. And I never think that they should abandon the run completely because that puts way too much pressure on Kirk Cousins and he starts throwing interceptions. So I do think it's vital to keep some sense of balance, but maybe try to get a little bit more aggressive earlier in the game rather than waiting. But be that as it may, the Redskins do, at the current moment, heading into Week 7, have a top five early down success rate offense. In terms of teams that are rising, I'm shocked that the Denver Broncos aren't in this mix already, but they aren't even top five. They haven't been top five all year. Last year, they were mainstays there at the top of the list. So this offense is not nearly as efficient as it was last year. Peyton Manning flinging the ball all over the field. They definitely are trying to run it a little bit more. They haven't had extreme success. Knowshon Moreno was huge for them running the ball last season. He's obviously gone, so the run plays aren't generating as much, and they aren't gaining, skipping and bypassing third downs as frequently as they used to do. So they're on the rise, but they are not top five currently. And the Dallas Cowboys also are a team that's rising in your early down success rate offense. Obviously, this is one of the best offenses in the NFL, one of the most balanced. Perhaps one of the only reasons that they aren't already there is because they focus so much on running the ball that, in general, you're not going to average over 5 yards carry throughout the course of the game, so that when you are running the ball, you're probably going to be faced with third and short if you're having some semblance of success running on first and second downs if you so choose. And so therefore you are facing a fair number of third downs where teams that will pass the ball more frequently generally are going to gain more than 4 yards passing, and so they'll typically be able to skip some more third down attempts, those teams that have fewer passes, as long as they're somewhat efficient when they're passing the football. Looking at the bottom five offenses, nothing really here has changed. The Bills, Jets, Jaguars, Vikings, and Lions. In terms of teams that are falling, getting worse, the Arizona Cardinals definitely fall into this category, and it's sort of been a slow progression for them, but it's been accentuated with the return of Carson Palmer last week. Carson Palmer conducted a very short passing attack compared to what this team has done in the past. I believe I'll get into some of these metrics, but they were attempting 6 passes of 20-plus yards per game down the field with Drew Stanton at quarterback. With Carson Palmer in his first game, they only attempted 2, and both of them were incomplete. He was throwing the ball a lot shorter, and they didn't have a lot of success running the ball against the Redskins defense, so that led to a lot of third downs in that game. It'll be interesting to see how this offense performs moving forward, because I kind of like their aggressiveness under Drew Stanton and their willingness to push the ball down the field. I think while he wasn't as accurate, his ceiling was higher in terms of opening that offense up with Michael Floyd and with a little short John Brown rookie. And so, Carson Palmer is much more of I'll throw it to my tight ends and Larry Fitzgerald, and doesn't utilize these little quick guys or the big quick guys down the field quite as often, at least in last week's game, and obviously last season he did not either. So that's kind of hamstringing this offense a little bit, because that opens up things in the run game if you're able to complete some big things down the field as opposed to keeping everything short. So we'll see where that progresses. The Bucs are obviously following this offense. Mike Glennon's there now, and he can do some things okay, but, is not executing that offense very well, even though he's kept them in a couple of games, won a game in Pittsburgh. That offense is not early down success rate savvy at the moment. Look at movers, 2 teams that had great weekends last week, the Miami Dolphins and the Philadelphia Eagles in terms of early down success rate. Offense, 2 teams that did not. Of course, the Giants are going to be there, as well as the Seattle Seahawks. Moving over to the defensive side, mainstays, Lions, Vikings, Jets, Ravens, and Seahawks all up there. Teams on the rise, the Dolphins and the Cowboys. The Cowboys defense, surprisingly enough, it's not just pure smoke and mirrors. They are forcing teams into a lot of third downs defensively, and I know it's helped out a lot by how good their offense is and how that offense is producing, and that's certainly a role. The offense helps the defense and vice versa. Without that offense doing what they were doing, there's no way this Dallas Cowboys defense that's currently constructed with the personnel that they currently have would ever even be close to being a good team in early down success rate defense, but that offense helps them out so much, putting them in great situations on the scoreboard that they're able to execute well. If you look at the bottom 5, Colts, Packers, Raiders, Patriots, Titans are a new appearance here on this list. Jacksonville Jaguars played pretty well early on success rate offense against them last week, and we know that the Colts had a lot of success against them too, so they have now entered the bottom 5. In terms of teams falling defensively, the Giants looked terrible against Philadelphia Eagles last week, of course, as well as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Obviously, we saw what Joe Flacco and the Baltimore Ravens were able to do to them. In terms of movers, the teams that performed the worst last week, Philadelphia Eagles performed the best. Dallas Cowboys, also great early down success rate offense. And guys who performed the worst last week, who dropped a little bit on the list, Arizona Cardinals, like I mentioned earlier, kind of hinted at that. Their defense was performing pretty poorly here against the Washington Redskins. That's why the Washington Redskins had good early on success rate offensive numbers last week. And the Indianapolis Colts, even though they were able to win against the Houston Texans, the Texans had a really good performance, very abnormal for them to be able to perform as well as they did in early down success rate. And so the Colts definitely were one of the worst teams last week, and they're already bottom 5, so that didn't help their cause very much at all. Now, switch over to the next slide. We'll talk about 30 and in touchdown percentage. This is a stat to all the guys who've been following me for a couple of years now. You know what the stat is. Go ahead and explain it to all the new guys. This is a stat I came up with, which kind of combines a few different efficiency metrics in general, but what it mainly looks at is average starting field position and can you score points on drives when you're driving from average starting field position. I wanted to eliminate, going through some analysis, actually, the year when the Baltimore Ravens won the Super Bowl. I was looking at teams' performances, and a lot of teams were getting short fields, and their offense was doing really good when they had short fields, but when they had to work the length of the field, their offense was not nearly as efficient. And while that might seem obvious, if you're a team that would be able to put its opponent into long field situations, which there are a lot of teams who can put their opponent into long field situations mainly by just being somewhat efficient offensively, not turning the ball over, you're going to put this team back at average starting field position, which in the NFL is around the 28.5-yard line, so that's why it says 30 and in. So we look at starting field position from your own 30 or worse toward your own goal line. How often are you able to drive the length of the field to score touchdowns? Not field goals. I don't care about field goals, really. I care about 7-point touchdowns. And so look at the best teams in the league who are able to convert these both offensively and defensively. We're incorporating both offense and defensive numbers into these rankings in terms of the column on the far left and the far right, which is top 7 and bottom 7. See, the top 7 teams, the teams that are the best offensively at keeping drives alive from average starting field position and scoring touchdowns, as well as preventing opponents from starting at average starting field position and driving for touchdowns against you. Those are the top 7 teams there on the left. And the one thing that all these teams have in common, I guess, except for the Baltimore Ravens, simply because of the tie for the Carolina Panthers last week to the Bengals, as well as the Bengals beating them outright, the Baltimore Ravens are actually second place in the AFC North at present, behind the 3-1-1 Cincinnati Bengals. But if you look at this list, it's basically all the teams that made the top 7 are first place in their division. And if they're not first place in their division, it's because the first place team is also in the top 7. So that's why you see the Denver Broncos are the 4th best team, but the Chargers are the top team in the league, and they're in first place in that division. And same thing with the Colts and the Texans. The Colts are in first place in that division, but the Texans are very good in this 30 and in touchdown percentage metric, and so they're on this list as well. So it really defines why some of these teams are so successful is they're very efficient at marching the ball down the field, scoring touchdowns, and preventing opponents from doing the same. And that's from this third and in touchdown percentage metric. You look at the bottom 7 teams, the Jets, the Rams, the Vikings, the Titans, the Raiders, the Buccaneers, and the Jaguars. I think you can look at anybody's power rankings or power ratings and anybody's layout of who the best and the worst teams are in the NFL. And I think all these teams would be on the list of probably the bottom 7 or maybe the bottom 8 or 9 based on some differing opinions by some people. But regardless of that, this is not a power rating for me. This is not any type of analysis for me. This is just my 30 and in touchdown percentage statistics, offense, defense weighed together. And these are the worst 7 teams there. And as it turns out, this statistic, as you can see, is very reflective of true success in the NFL. I'm not doing any sort of fudging or anything here. These really are the top 7 and bottom 7 teams in this, and they really seem to be some of the best teams in the NFL and some of the worst teams. Now, of course, there are teams on the not on the top 7, like the San Francisco 49ers, the Seattle Seahawks. Those teams are actually number 8 and 9. So I kept it at 7, but some teams are top 10 offensively that you might be like, well, why isn't this team here? Why isn't that team here? But in general, these are very solid top 7 and bottom 7. When you look at the O only or D only, that's offense or defense only. So, for instance, the Saints have a very good offense, and so do the Packers in the stat, but their defensive numbers not good. And vice versa, defensive only. The Bills and the Lions, very good defensive numbers in the stat, but their offensive numbers aren't good. So they end up being middle of the pack when we look at this thing averaged and weighted to combine offense and defensive numbers together. But when you look at which teams excel on certain sides of the ball, those teams have their strengths and certainly their weaknesses, and those are very evident by this statistic as well. So I haven't introduced this to you on the podcast thus far in terms of displaying it, but this was a good week to do so, and now you get a good taste of where teams stand based upon this ranking, and also how accurate and strong this metric I invented is at actually predicting and helping to understand teams and where they stand and line up in the NFL. With that said, let's jump right into analyzing some of these games. It's going to be a pretty exciting 45 minutes or so here, and we'll go through all these games.